A chaotic and desperate flight is underway from the ruins of Pokrovsk as thousands of Ukrainian soldiers engage in a disorganized retreat under weathering Russian fire. The collapse of the city's defense has triggered a full-scale withdrawal that military observers are describing as a rout marking one of the most significant and visually dramatic turning points in the entire conflict. What the Ukrainian General Staff has officially termed a tactical redeployment to pre-prepared defense line is revealing itself on the ground as a frantic scramble for survival. Columns of exhausted troops, many on foot, are streaming westward along roads littered with abandoned and destroyed military hardware. The scenes of fleeing soldiers, targeted relentlessly by Russian artillery and swarms of attack drones, provide a grim and visceral confirmation of Russia's victory and underscore the dire state of the Ukrainian military in the Donbas region. This mass retreat not only cedes a vast swath of territory to Moscow, but also risks the encirclement and destruction of some of Ukraine's most combat-capable units, potentially altering the strategic map of the war for months to come. The final hours of the battle for Pokrovsk were a scene of utter pandemonium. The Russian pincer movement, which had been tightening for weeks, finally closed, leaving the Ukrainian garrison with a stark choice: attempt a perilous breakout or face stern annihilation. The command to withdraw came late, and for many units, it came in a fragmented and confused manner. Communication lines had been shredded by relentless Russian electronic warfare and artillery strike, leaving individual platoons and companies isolated and forced to make an independent decision. The structured, orderly withdrawal that military doctrine calls for was simply impossible under the circumstance. Instead, what transpired was a headlong rush for the new remaining escape routes, primarily the main highway leading west toward the city of Dnipro. This road, now infamously known as the Road of Death, became a shooting gallery for the Russian force who had anticipated this very move. Russian artillery, pre-sighted on key intersections and choke points, unleashed a fierce torrent of shells onto the retreating columns. At the same time, Lancet loitering munitions and FPV, or first-person view drones operated by Russian soldiers from miles away, hunted for targets of opportunity. They swarm over the road, striking Ukrainian armored vehicles, trucks, and even ambulances with chilling precision. Video released by the Russian Ministry of Defense and circulated widely on pro-Kremlin social media channels shows a landscape of devastation. Tanks with their turrets blown off, smoldering infantry fighting vehicle, and civilian cars repurposed by the military lie abandoned in ditches. The footage captured Ukrainian soldiers running across open field, desperately trying to find cover from the drones that buzz menacingly overhead. The retreat from Pokrovsk is not just a military defeat, it is a human tragedy unfolding in real time, broadcast to the world as a powerful piece of Russian war propaganda. The soldiers who managed to escape bear the physical and psychological scars of the ordeal. They speak of utter chaos, of unit disintegrating under the sheer weight of fire. They describe running out of ammunition, being unable to fire back at the enemy. Many had to abandon their heavy equipment, including tanks, artillery pieces, and armored personnel carriers, because they were either damaged, out of fuel, or simply could not navigate the crater and blocked road. The loss of this equipment represents a catastrophic blow to the Ukrainian military, as much of it was supplied by Western partners and would be extremely difficult to replace in the short term. The soldiers themselves are demoralized and exhausted. They have been fighting for weeks without relief, without adequate supplies, and without effective air cover. The accounts paint a picture of a defense that was not broken by a single brilliant Russian maneuver, but was instead methodically ground down until it simply ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The government in Kyiv has been struggling to control the narrative. President Volodymyr Zelensky's nightly video address struck a defiant but somber tone. He acknowledged the extremely difficult situation in the Donetsk region and paid tribute to the heroes who had defended Pokrovsk. He insisted that the withdrawal was a necessary decision to save the lives of soldiers and to regroup for future battles. To save our people, we are moving our force to more fortified positions. Zelensky stated, "The enemy may occupy the land, but they will never occupy our spirit or our will to be free." However, This official messaging is being increasingly undermined by the raw and unfiltered reports coming from the front line. The stark contrast between the government portrayal of an organized redeployment and the soldiers' accounts of a desperate flight has created a palpable sense of unease within Ukrainian society. Military bloggers and independent journalists have been openly critical of the high command, questioning the strategic decisions that led to the encirclement and the failure to supply the garrison adequately. For Moscow, the capture of Pokrovsk and the subsequent rout of Ukrainian force is a moment of supreme triumph. Russian state television has been running celebratory coverage nonstop, with anchors declaring a historic victory. The Kremlin is using the event to protect an image of overwhelming military strength and to validate President Vladimir Putin's war strategy. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, told reporters that the operation to liberate Pokrovsk was executed flawlessly and demonstrated the growing professionalism and power of the Russian army. He added that the retreat of Ukraine forces showed the futility of the Kyiv regime's resistance and should serve as a signal to Washington and its allies that the policy of supporting Ukraine is doomed to fail. Former President Dmitry Medvedev posted a typically abrasive message on his social media, mocking the Ukrainian military and suggesting that President Zelensky should start preparing his surrender document. The propaganda value of this victory is immense for the Kremlin, both for its domestic audience and for its international partner, particularly China and India, reinforcing their decision to stand with Russia against American pressure. The news of the Ukrainian collapse has reverberated loudly in Washington, where the Trump administration is closely watching the event unfold as the deadline for its own ultimatum to Moscow approach. The development have been seized upon by different factions within the administration to support their pre-existing position. President Donald Trump sees the fall of Pokrovsk and the chaotic retreat as a complete vindication of his approach. In a series of statements made to reporters on the White House lawn, President Trump was blunt. It's a disaster, a total disaster, and it's a shame, he said. We've been watching this for a long time. We're losing, we saw it, everybody saw it. Our generals, the best generals, they told me this was happening. This is why we had to do something different, the old way. Just sending money, sending weapons, it wasn't working. It was just making the war longer and getting more people killed. What you're seeing now, this terrible thing, this is why I said we have to end this war, and we're going to end it. Our deadline is coming up, and Russia knows we're serious. China knows we're serious. Everybody knows it. The president placed the blame for the collapse squarely on the failure of previous policies and on the reluctance of European nations to contribute more significantly to Ukraine's defense. This sentiment was echoed and amplified by key members of his cabinet. Secretary of State Marco Rubio held an emergency press conference to lay out the administration's diplomatic positions in light of the new reality on the ground. The events of the last 48 hours are a human tragedy and a stark military reality, Rubio began, his expression grim. They demonstrate with painful clarity what this administration has been saying for months. This conflict has no purely military solution. Continuing down the path of open-ended warfare will only lead to more scenes like the one we are witnessing outside of Pokrovsk. It will lead to the destruction of Ukraine. That is why President Trump took the bold step of setting a firm deadline for a ceasefire. It was not a threat made lightly. It was a recognition that the status quo was unsustainable. The collapse of the Ukrainian front in the Donbas should be a wake-up call to everyone in Kyiv, in Moscow, and in the capital of Europe. The time for illusion is over. The time for negotiated peace is now. Rubio revealed that he had been in contact with his counterparts in Europe, urging them to support the American push for an immediate cessation of hostility. At the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth provided a sober military assessment that reinforced the president's message. He described the Ukrainian retreat as a cascading system failure brought on by critical shortage and overwhelming Russian firepower. What we have seen is a classic case of attritional warfare, Hegseth explained to defense correspondent. The Russian military was able to concentrate an immense amount of artillery, air power, and manpower on a single sector of the front and simply overwhelmed the defenders. The Ukrainian force fought with tremendous grit, but they were critically deficient in three key areas: artillery ammunition, air defense, and fortified position deep enough to withstand heavy guided bombs. This outcome was predictable given the resource disparity. It underscores the point I have been making repeatedly. Our European allies must invest in their own defense industrial base. They cannot expect the United States to be the sole guarantor of their security and the primary supplier for every conflict. Our review of military assistance is aimed at ensuring we have a sustainable and realistic strategy, not one that leads to brave soldiers being sent to unwinnable fight. The intelligence community, under Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, had reportedly been issuing warning about the fragility of the Pokrovsk front for some time. Those familiar with the intelligence briefing indicate that reports sent to the White House had highlighted the growing logistical and manpower crisis within the Ukrainian army and the increasing effectiveness of Russia's new tactics, particularly the use of guided bombs. Director Gabbard, a prominent advocate for a less interventionist foreign policy, is said to view the Ukrainian military's collapse as the tragic but predictable result of overextending American commitment abroad. He believes the event strengthened the case for a fundamental reevaluation of American strategic priorities, moving away from involvement in regional conflicts and focusing on domestic concerns and direct threats to the U.S. homeland. Her perspective aligns perfectly with President Trump's America First doctrine and provides an intellectual framework for the administration's pivot away from unconditional support for Kyiv. The strategic consequences of this retreat are dire for Ukraine. The loss of Pokrovsk and the subsequent flight has torn a massive hole in the country's defensive posture in the Donbas. Russian forces are now in a position to exploit this gap and advance rapidly westward across open country before the Ukrainians have a chance to establish a new, coherent defensive line. The next logical targets for Russia would be the cities of Mirnorad and Selidov, but the ultimate prize would be an advance toward the Dnipro River, which would effectively cut Ukraine in half. The psychological impact on the Ukrainian nations is immense. For over 2 years, the narrative of a heroic and successful defense against a larger aggressor has sustained the country's will to fight. The image of a routed army could shatter that narrative and lead to recriminations and a crisis of confidence in the country's military and political leadership. For the Trump administration, the Ukrainian military's misfortune provides a powerful, if grim, justification for its high-stakes diplomatic gamble. As Russian troops advance and Kyiv's position weakens, the pressure on President Zelensky to accept a ceasefire on terms largely dictated by Moscow and Washington will become almost unbearable. The flight from Pokrovsk is more than just a battle lost. It is a turning point that has accelerated the timeline for a dramatic and potentially brutal end to the war. Many of my listeners, like 70%, haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel. And so many of you don't even know that you haven't subscribed. That is actually what makes the show going. It's almost like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask again and again, because it enables us to grow and grow and grow. And we're going for the long haul here. And listen, if this is your first time listening to world global conflict, you don't have to subscribe. You guys, your first one's on me. But if you have watched this show before, it's like you are a freeloader now. So all I would ask you is, if you have seen this show before and you like it, help me. Help my team here. Hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build this show for you. That I swear. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. That's all for me for today. I will see you soon. Bye for now.